The U.S. has changed. That's their right. We must respond. That is our imperative. The pipeline will transport at least 1 million barrels of low-emission Alberta bitumen a day, with a route that increases access to new Asian markets as a priority. We're taking our future in our hands. We're catalyzing generational investments by creating the right conditions to get big things built here in Alberta and right across Canada.
Canada just pulled off a move almost no ally of the United States has ever dared to attempt. While Donald Trump doubles down on tariffs and rewrites America's place in global trade, Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped to a podium in Calgary and made an announcement that Washington never believed Ottawa would have the courage to make. Canada is preparing to send its energy directly to Asia through a new Pacific pipeline bypassing the United States entirely. For decades, one rule quietly governed North American energy. If Canada wanted to sell oil, it flowed south. But today, in a moment that will redefine the relationship between the two countries, Carney signaled that the days of unquestioned dependence on the American market are over.
The announcement came during a major address where Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith unveiled a federal-provincial framework to build a new export pipeline from northern Alberta to the British Columbia coast. Unlike the symbolic proposals of the past, this one comes with a clear commitment: a privately financed pipeline built with Indigenous co-ownership capable of moving up to 1 million barrels of low-emission Alberta bitumen a day straight to Asian markets. Carney made it clear that Ottawa will fast-track the project under the new Major Projects Office, which was created specifically to accelerate nation-building infrastructure. And in the sharpest break yet from old political taboos, he announced that Canada is prepared to adjust its own tanker restrictions, long seen as untouchable, if they stand in the way of accessing Asian buyers. Alongside the pipeline plan, Carney openly addressed the underlying reason for this shift. Trump's tariff regime, combined with escalating uncertainty from Washington, has cost Canada an estimated $50 billion so far, a figure sourced from Canadian internal economic modeling and widely echoed by analysts covering North American trade. Carney reminded the audience that 95% of Canadian energy exports still go to the United States, and that the vast majority of lumber, steel, and aluminum also depend on American buyers. What used to be a strategic advantage has now become, in his words, a vulnerability. Then he delivered the line that instantly changed the tone of the room. The U.S. has changed. That's their right. We must respond. That is our imperative. It was the clearest signal yet that Canada is ready to operate by new rules. Since returning to the White House, Trump has treated tariffs as a universal tool. Pressure Canada, pressure Mexico, pressure China, pressure Europe. The underlying theory is that every partner needs access to the U.S. market more than the U.S. needs access to theirs. It is a worldview built on leverage. The problem for Washington is that Canada just upended this logic. Instead of retaliating tariff for tariff, Carney chose a far more consequential path. He created a new route for Canadian energy that no longer depends on American politics or American refiners. In practical terms, this means the United States loses the near-exclusive position it once held over Canadian heavy crude. For decades, U.S. Gulf Coast refineries relied on Canadian heavy oil as their most stable and cost-effective supply. Analysts have long described this dependence as structural. It takes years and billions of dollars to reconfigure refineries away from heavy crude. When Canada builds a corridor to Asia, it weakens the United States' negotiating position not for a year or two, but for an entire generation. Trump may escalate tariffs, but he can't change the physics of America's refining system. The simple truth is this: the United States needs Canadian heavy crude more than Canada needs American buyers. That is why this decision hits harder than any counter tariff ever could.
What makes this moment unprecedented isn't just the pipeline itself, it's the political symbolism behind it. No traditional U.S. ally, not Japan or South Korea or Germany, has structured a national energy strategy explicitly designed to bypass the United States. Canada is the first. This shift speaks to a growing reality. Since Trump's return, Ottawa has faced a wave of policies that treat Canada less like a partner and more like a bargaining chip. Aluminum duties, lumber duties, auto threats, battery incentives tied to U.S.-only sourcing. For months, Canada absorbed the pressure. Now, Carney is sending a message. Canada will not be cornered. He paired the pipeline plan with a broader strategy worth over $1 trillion in total investment over 5 years, including new hydro, nuclear, LNG, critical minerals, and sovereign AI infrastructure. These are not defensive measures, they're offensive. They're designed to build a diversified, resilient economy that does not hinge on who sits in the Oval Office.
Energy demand in Asia is long-term, predictable, and rising. Japan and South Korea continue to rely heavily on imported energy. India is searching for stable suppliers. Southeast Asia's consumption is expanding rapidly. Meanwhile, the United States under Trump has become a market defined by volatility, one where tariffs shift overnight, subsidies shift with political cycles, and allies are constantly forced to recalculate their exposure. For Canadian producers, Asian markets offer something the U.S. doesn't: long contracts, reliable pricing, and less political interference. If Canada can deliver its oil directly to Asia, the discount applied to Canadian crude in American markets shrinks dramatically. That means higher revenues, stronger royalties, and greater economic independence. Once that happens, no U.S. administration, Trump or otherwise, can treat Canada as a captive supplier again.
Trump will not ignore this shift. Washington will frame it as a betrayal, a miscalculation, or a political stunt. There will be warnings about air auto tariffs, cross-border energy rules, or even new constraints on Canadian imports. But none of these threats altered the basic structural reality. The United States cannot replace Canadian heavy oil, and Canada is no longer willing to accept a future built entirely around U.S. demand. This moment represents something far bigger than a pipeline. It is Canada stepping out of America's shadow, not with anger, but with strategy. When future historians look back on 2025, this announcement may be remembered as the moment Canada redefined its role in North America. For decades, Canadians were told they had no choice but to rely on the United States. Mark Carney just proved that was never true. Canada is no longer waiting for Washington to treat it fairly. Canada is building the world it wants, the partners it chooses, and the economy it controls. And now the real question begins. If Canada can take this bold a step once, what will it do next? And how will Trump respond when he realizes that for the first time in a generation, he has no leverage left?
What if Canada decided to strike back in the trade war, not with steel, autos, or lumber, but with something far more dangerous to Donald Trump's political survival? Eggs and poultry. For years, dairy products have been the classic flashpoint between Ottawa and Washington, a sector where Canada's supply management system, with its tight quotas and sky-high over-quota tariffs, has blocked American producers and repeatedly triggered Trump's anger. If dairy can spark presidential outbursts and trade threats, imagine what would happen if Canada applied the same pressure to U.S. eggs and poultry, a sector even more politically explosive for Trump. This is the weapon almost nobody talks about, except the people who matter most to Trump: farmers, processors, and rural voters across the U.S. Farm Belt. If Ottawa ever turned its supply-managed egg and poultry system into a trade counterstrike, the impact on the United States would be immediate, deeply political, and impossible for Trump to ignore. Because in the U.S., eggs aren't just food, they're votes.
The world has become more dangerous and divided. Many of our former strengths, based on our close ties to America, have become our vulnerabilities.
To understand the stakes, we need to zoom out and look at the political map of 2025. Trump is deep into his second term, leaning heavily on tariffs as his go-to negotiating tactic. Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, has avoided retaliation so far, choosing diplomacy while expanding trade ties with Asia. But behind that calm exterior, Ottawa still holds unusually sharp leverage thanks to its supply management regime, a system that controls production, restricts imports, and legally shields entire sectors through quotas and high over-quota tariffs.
It means that our economic strategy needs to change dramatically and rapidly. Above all, we will build Canadian. We'll be our own best customer.
We have a supply managed system in Canada, which is just as the name suggests, it's managing supply. We introduced it in 1972, and it's Canadian production for Canadian consumers.
Eggs and poultry sit inside that framework, just like dairy. And this is where the what-if becomes explosive. The U.S. poultry and egg industries are not just economic pillars, they are political fortresses. Their geography overlaps almost perfectly with Trump's electoral base. Iowa, Georgia, Arkansas, Missouri, Ohio, Pennsylvania. These are not just farm states, they were the backbone of Trump's coalition. That's why agricultural retaliation has always been Washington's nightmare. When China targeted soybeans during the 2018-2019 trade war, the shock almost derailed Trump's standing in the Midwest. If that was the impact when the adversary was Beijing, imagine the pressure if Canada, a friendly neighbor, disrupted access instead. The economic scale alone makes the hypothetical serious. The United States produces roughly $57 to $60 billion worth of poultry and egg products every year. A significant portion of that output depends on stable export markets to prevent domestic oversupply. And Canada, because of proximity and reliability, consistently ranks among the top buyers of American processed eggs, yolks, and chicken cuts. So if Ottawa ever slowed licensing, recalibrated quotas, tightened inspection windows, or simply shifted allocations toward non-U.S. suppliers, all fully legal under WTO rules, American producers would feel the consequences almost immediately. Supplies would back up, prices could soften. Rural counties might start questioning why the White House provoked a response it wasn't prepared to handle. This is why the scenario matters. Eggs and poultry are Trump's blind spot. They touch not just the farm economy, but the electoral core he counts on. Canada wouldn't need dramatic action. Its supply management structure already offers subtle but powerful tools. Imports are capped by quota, and anything above that threshold faces steep, often prohibitive tariffs. Ottawa administers these quotas with considerable discretion, adjusting timing, pacing, sanitary reviews, or allocation priorities. Even modest changes could shape real-world outcomes. A slight slowdown in licensing during peak U.S. production could create bottlenecks. A shift in quota allocation could favor European or Asian suppliers. An additional inspection requirement could delay shipments just long enough to unsettle markets. All of this would be legal, incremental, and fully consistent with the way Canada has historically defended dairy access during past U.S.-Canada disputes. For Trump, the political cost would be immediate. Governors in poultry-heavy states could accuse Washington of mismanaging trade. Farm associations, among Trump's most loyal supporters, would demand clarity. And rural voters, who already faced price shocks and disease-related disruptions in recent years, might see any loss of export access as needless turmoil triggered by Washington's tariffs.
Trump might ignore retaliation in sectors like lumber or aluminum, but he cannot ignore agriculture, because agriculture is his political oxygen. Every rural rally he holds reinforces the message that he is the defender of American farmers. If Canada were ever to tighten poultry and egg access, even symbolically, it would immediately test that narrative. America's domestic food economy is fragile. Inflation remains a central complaint among voters. A shakeup in poultry and egg markets could raise prices for consumers, even as farmers face falling export income, the worst possible combination for any president. Meanwhile, media in the U.S. would amplify the story. Did the tariff war backfire? Why is Canada hitting American farmers? Is Trump risking his base? The political pressure would be intense long before any formal trade action escalated.
While the exact figures would depend on the severity of Canada's action, existing agricultural data allows for a realistic estimate. USDA numbers indicate that Canada buys roughly $700 to $900 million USD worth of American poultry, eggs, and processed egg products annually, across all related HS categories. If Ottawa reduced access by as little as 15 to 20% through slower licensing, preference shifts, or added sanitary reviews, U.S. producers could hypothetically lose around $100 to $180 million per year in direct export revenue. Because the sector runs on tight margins, the knock-on effects could push total losses into the $250 to $300 million range once oversupply, domestic price drops, and inventory write-downs are factored in. Those numbers are small relative to the U.S. economy as a whole, but massive inside the rural counties that determine American elections. And that is where the real danger lies for Trump.
For Canada, the fallout of such a hypothetical response would be limited. The country is largely self-sufficient in eggs and poultry, and domestic producers would quickly fill any gap. Consumers might see minor fluctuations, but the overall system would remain stable. The greater risk would be political, the possibility of provoking Washington into reopening agricultural chapters of USMCA, but that risk already exists under Trump's escalating tariff strategy. And that brings us to the heart of the matter. In trade conflicts, the most powerful weapons are often the quietest ones. Eggs and poultry may seem unremarkable, but they underpin the politics of rural America. If Canada ever chose to use this leverage, the hypothetical fallout in the U.S. Farm Belt could be significant. Shaken prices, anxious producers, pressure from governors, and a wave of criticism from the very voters Trump depends on. For now, this remains only a scenario, not a prediction, but a warning. Because in the US-Canada trade standoff, the next decisive move may not come from factories or forests, but from something far smaller and far more politically explosive, the humble egg.
In September, we announced the first tranche of these projects that we referred to the Major Projects Office for accelerated deployment. On top of that list is the new Darlington nuclear project. Canada's new government is putting forward $2 billion to build new clean energy technology, the first of its kind in Canada.
Canada is on its way to becoming an energy superpower, and it's happening faster than anyone expected. East of Toronto, at the Darlington nuclear site, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Ontario Premier Doug Ford stood side by side to announce what they called a turning point in Canada's industrial story. The two leaders unveiled a massive plan, 4 new small modular reactors, or SMRs, backed by $2 billion from the federal government and another $1 billion from Ontario's Building Ontario Fund. The Darlington project will be the first of its kind in the G7 and Canada's boldest step yet into next-generation nuclear power. By placing it in the major projects category, Ottawa and Queen's Park can speed up regulatory approvals and construction, trimming years off the normal process. What looks like a regional energy project is, in reality, a national industrial strategy. It is designed to protect Canadian supply chains, secure energy independence, and rebuild high-value jobs that have been squeezed by America's aggressive trade policy. While Washington leans on tariffs to pull production south, Canada is betting on reactors to keep its industries alive at home. The Darlington SMR plan marks the start of a new era for Canadian energy. The reactors will use GE Hitachi's BWRX-300 technology, a compact modular design that produces about 300 megawatts each, roughly one-third the output of a conventional nuclear plant, but built at a fraction of the cost and time. The site east of Toronto is already being prepared by Ontario Power Generation, OPG, which operates the existing Darlington station. According to OPG's project filings in 2025, construction will support as many as 18,000 jobs across Ontario and generate around $500 million in local economic activity every year once the 4 units are running. For Carney and Ford, this is not just about electricity, it is about building an industrial base that can resist external shocks. Nuclear energy provides stable, emission-free power that manufacturers, data centers, and transport networks will depend on for decades. Carney called it a foundation for Canada's next industrial century, emphasizing that homegrown energy is key to long-term competitiveness. By declaring the reactors a major project, Ottawa cut the average approval time by nearly 40%, allowing groundwork to start immediately. The move signals a shift from bureaucracy to execution, a practical, business-like approach to nation-building. For Ford, whose province remains Canada's manufacturing hub, the stakes are high. Ontario's economy has lost thousands of auto and steel jobs as global supply chains shifted under U.S. tariffs. The SMR investment promises to restore confidence that Ontario can once again anchor heavy industry with reliable, affordable power made in Canada.
Canada's first SMR is being built east of Toronto with plans in place to build 3 more units at that same site, and it could serve as a blueprint for Alberta.
The impact of Darlington's announcement didn't stop at Ontario's borders. It sparked a wave of interest across the country, and Alberta was quick to answer. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith revealed that her province would begin public consultations on adding nuclear power to its energy mix. Alberta has long depended on natural gas to supply electricity, but the Premier said small, modular reactors could offer a cleaner and more reliable base load, especially for the province's massive oil sands operations. The model she pointed to was Darlington. The 4 SMRs being built east of Toronto are now the blueprint for Canada's nuclear future, a modular system that can be replicated province by province. Smith noted that SMRs can be prefabricated and shipped to site, cutting both costs and construction risk. The technology's scalability is what makes it attractive. Each 300-megawatt reactor can power roughly 300,000 homes, and multiple units can be combined for larger grids. For Alberta, this isn't just an energy decision, it's an industrial one. The province aims to attract nuclear-related manufacturing, engineering, and maintenance jobs, the kind that sustain long-term regional growth. By aligning with Ontario's lead, Alberta joins a growing national shift toward nuclear collaboration, signaling that Canada's path to energy independence is no longer an Ontario story, but a pan-Canadian transformation. Together, the two provinces represent opposite poles of the country's energy landscape, one rooted in manufacturing, the other in hydrocarbons, now united by a common goal: to make Canada self-reliant in power generation and industrial security. South of the border, the news from Ontario came as a surprise. The Trump administration has spent 2025 doubling down on tariffs that were meant to pull investment back to American soil. By targeting Canadian steel, aluminum, and autos with 25% duties, Washington hoped to weaken its northern neighbor's competitiveness. But instead of retreating, Canada moved in the opposite direction. Tariffs that were meant to hurt have forced Canada to reinvent itself. The Darlington SMR clan is the clearest example of that. A project born from pressure, financed through national funds, and built entirely within Canada's borders. Economists at PwC Canada noted in September 2025 that federal energy investments now account for over 3% of GDP, the highest in 2 decades. Much of this growth is driven by infrastructure spending linked to the nuclear sector. In other words, Trump's economic squeeze has pushed Canada to re-industrialize faster than expected. The irony is hard to ignore. As U.S. companies lobby for tax breaks to offset rising import costs, Canadian firms are finding stability in government-backed energy and construction contracts. While Trump's tariffs raised prices in American factories, they also made Canada's domestic production more attractive to global investors seeking predictable energy costs. The political contrast is striking. Trump's strategy relies on confrontation. Carney's relies on capacity. One weaponizes tariffs, the other builds reactors. The outcome is clear. As the U.S. turns inward, Canada is scaling up. From Darlington to Alberta, a pattern is emerging. Canada is transforming from a supplier of raw materials to a producer of advanced energy infrastructure. Nuclear power, once a cautious experiment, has become a central pillar of the country's economic identity. The numbers tell the story. According to Ontario Power Generation's 2025 update, every billion US dollars invested in SMR development supports roughly 6,000 direct and indirect jobs. The Darlington cluster alone could generate over $2 billion in tax revenue over the next decade. These figures are driving new training programs, research partnerships, and supply chain investments across the country. The Alberta consultations show that momentum is spreading. Provinces are no longer waiting for federal incentives. They are competing to host the next wave of nuclear manufacturing. For the United States, this shift carries strategic consequences. By insulating its economy with tariffs, Washington may have triggered a new competitor next door, one that combines clean energy leadership with industrial stability. Canada's nuclear build-out gives it something every modern economy craves: dependable, affordable power in a volatile world. What began as a $3 billion investment east of Toronto is now a national mission. Factories, universities, and provincial governments are aligning around the same idea, that Canada's strength lies not in chasing America's policies, but in charting its own. In that sense, the reactors rising at Darlington are more than concrete and steel. They are a declaration of independence. Trump wanted to make America dominant again, but in doing so, he may have created his toughest rival yet, an energy superpower being built quietly just across the border.
Well, U.S. President Donald Trump is threatening to impose a 100% tariff on all movies made outside of the United States. In an early morning post, Trump lashed out at other countries for stealing, quote, candy from a baby.
The announcement came early in the morning, and it sent ripples through both Hollywood and Canada. President Donald Trump declared that he would impose a 100% tariff on every film made outside the United States. For decades, tariffs have been tools used against steel, cars, or electronics. Now, for the first time, the heart of American culture is pulled into the fight. A movie today is not a car shipped across a border. It is a digital service, an international collaboration, and a product that relies on talent worldwide. That is why the threat immediately raised alarms. Instead of strengthening American film, it risks shaking the foundations of an industry built on global reach.
Is the largest and most powerful film and television industry on the planet Earth. And it got that way by exporting its product. 80% of its revenues come from outside the United States. You know, White Lotus, that a lot of people enjoy, is an entirely American show, conceived in America, produced in America, owned by America, you know, and happens to be shot in spectacular locations around the world. It defies logic entirely that that kind of a show would attract some kind of tariff.
The United States has built the most powerful film and television sector in the world. More than 80% of its revenues come from exports to audiences outside America. Hollywood became dominant precisely because it could tell stories that traveled across borders. Now, the tariff threat puts that at risk. Productions rarely stay within U.S. borders. Ice road truckers had to film in Canada because the ice roads are there. White Lotus, an American show, was shot abroad even though it was fully conceived and owned in the U.S. Beyond filming sites, studios depend heavily on outsourcing. Visual effects and post-production often go to Canada, India, Vietnam, or South Korea, where costs are lower and expertise is deep. If projects using those services are branded as foreign-made, Hollywood itself will suffer. Costs rise, projects stall, and thousands of technical jobs could be disrupted. Even before a single tariff is collected, the chill is real. Energy is wasted on legal and financial calculations instead of storytelling. A measure presented as job protection risks undermining the very workforce it claims to defend.
As Premier Ford just said, a lot of this is talk. This is saber rattling at its finest. Nothing's been decided. And rather than speculate on worst-case scenarios, what matters is how Canada responds now, how Ontario responds.
Across the border, Canadian leaders and unions are watching closely. Canada's screen industry is a vital part of the economy. National figures show more than 12 billion Canadian dollars in annual production in 2022 and 2023, with roughly $4.8 billion directly sourced from American projects. Ontario alone records a $3 billion industry. The threat from Washington is serious, but Canadian voices emphasize resilience. Stable tax credits, training, and infrastructure are seen as the keys to keeping Hollywood North attractive. Provinces like Ontario and British Columbia have long used incentives to bring in American productions, and those policies remain intact. At the same time, Canada is not cornered. The industry has strong ties to Europe, the United Kingdom, and global streaming platforms. Canadian performers and crews can still reach international audiences even if U.S. projects slow. Rather than panic, the message from Canada is to double down on domestic strength while continuing to welcome global partners.
Not too slow. What emerges is a sharp contrast. In the United States, uncertainty spreads through the largest creative export sector, which depends on global sales for more than 4/5 of its revenue. Any retaliatory duties from Europe or Asia would cut directly into those profits. In Canada, by contrast, governments and unions are preparing to adapt. If American studios hesitate, Canadian producers can step forward, supported by provincial policies and international partnerships. Rather than crippling Canada, the tariff talk may highlight the advantages of filming there. The outcome is striking. A policy aimed at punishing foreign production threatens to wound Hollywood itself, while Canada steadies its own industry and looks outward. What was intended as a show of strength risks becoming another example of how Trump's tariffs backfire, leaving America weaker while its neighbor holds firm.